Welcome to the Reality Taboo. It's December 6th, 2025, and we are in the Candace Owens trilemma era. That's a term that was made famous by C.S. Lewis, who characterized the historical Jesus as one of three things, either a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. In the case of Candace Owens, it might be going a little bit overboard to leave that third option as a possibility. But even if that comparison is a little bit grandiose, it does a good job of helping understand how impactful and determinative the ongoing saga involving Candace Owens and accusations against Turning Point USA and the alphabet agencies and foreign governments and Glomo Homo more generally. What Candace Owens is not at this point in time is inconsequential, and that was a major point in C.S. Lewis's conception of the trilemma. The idea that he found most objectionable was that Jesus was an interesting human philosopher, someone who had some good ideas and some bad ideas, but who could, based on preference and taste, be cataloged among many other prophets and thinkers and moralists and philosophers over time. And in the case of Candace Owens, she isn't just another right-wing pundit or a cultural pundit, conservative, traditionalist, whatever adjectives one might use to describe her. What she is embroiled in, what she is in the middle of, is going to be utterly defining how the right side and populist side of politics plays out over the next several years and even decades potentially. Before we go through the three possibilities of what Candace Owens is in C.S. Lewis's trilemma, we'll talk about them in the context of what C.S. Lewis was talking about with Jesus Christ. And the first one, the idea that he is a liar, is pretty straightforward. It's the idea that he was a charlatan who existed in the 1st century AD when there was perceived turmoil in the Levant and there was a lot of religious strife taking place, and he saw an opportunity to make a name for himself by making grandiose claims about being the one true son of the one true God, and therefore being the most powerful human being in existence up to that point and ever in the future. And he did so for whatever personal reasons. He might have done so to have some sort of self-aggrandizement, although given the historicity of his story, it wasn't one that led to a lot of material wealth, material gain, nor did it redound to his benefit politically, but it did make him a focal point. And if there is something that we can use in the current year to understand the mindset of fame for fame's sake, well, we might be able to have some idea of why a liar, Jesus Christ, would have existed in the way that he did. That is to say, he made these outlandish claims for the sake of the sensationalism that they brought with them and the attention that was directed at him as a consequence of making these claims. The second option, that he was a lunatic, is the idea that he believed everything that he said, that he preached, that he taught, that he did. He believed all of it, but he was delusional. And that delusion, paired with a natural sense of charisma and authenticity and sincerity, even though the things that he was saying that he believed were empirically false, he believed them strongly, and so he was able to compel other people to believe him as well, but ultimately the things he believed in were superstition and fairy tale. And the third option is most self-explanatory of all. That was that he was Lord, that the things that he said and taught and the events that happened around him were divinely inspired, divinely directed, because he was the Son of God. In the case of Candace Owens, the first option, that she is a liar, is one that, and this can be taken with a grain of salt, this is just my handicapping of the Candace Owens situation, I think there is a negligible chance that this is the correct option. If we put it in percentage terms, 1% chance that she is simply lying about this, that she knows that the things that she's putting forward are false or intentionally misleading, or that she's grasping for straws, that she's playing fast and loose with the truth with the intention of self-aggrandizement and the positive exploitation for her own benefit of what happened to Charlie Kirk and the fallout for Turning Point USA. That's my assessment beyond listening to her, but also because if these claims were being spun out of whole cloth, then they would be very easily refutable, and that is a pattern that will emerge as we go through this, that is simply not being done by any of the antagonists to her story, including from other salient, popular pundits who are coming after her. The accusations that they're making are almost exclusively character impugning, motive shaming, clout chasing, ways of exploiting the tragedy to her own benefit. To the extent that there has been any empirical criticism of the things that she said, it's on account of her getting minor details incorrect, like her characterizing a fort in North Dakota as Fort Riley rather than Fort Ripley, or her getting the time stamps of Egyptian planes that were in Utah on the day of Charlie Kirk's assassination that had, according to flight logs, been in the same place as the Kirks, in particular Erica Kirk, several tens, maybe even hundreds of times over the last couple years, that she got the time zone off by an hour. And that was because these planes also flew in and out of Arizona, which was where Turning Point USA and Charlie Kirk is based. And although Arizona is just south of Utah, Utah observes daylight savings time and Arizona doesn't. And so it's been 95% character assassination and 5% these sort of details that are then laundered through other outlets who then claim, on account of the time zone being off with the planes or the fort being misidentified, that the Owens assertions have been, quote, debunked, unquote. The second potential option, that Owens is a lunatic, is one that I put at about a 20% chance of characterizing the situation. The evidence that slots in here is her recounting dreams that she said she has had of Charlie Kirk, which are effectively, in a Christian conception of things, are more like visions that she has while asleep. And this is something that is going to be quite familiar with people who have a passing familiarity with the Bible. This is how God often communicates, how the supernatural often communicates with humans, is by manifesting messages in this way. And in the dream, Charlie Kirk compels her to keep pushing, that she's moving in the right direction, that there is a massive cover-up here. And she additionally recounts visions that he had about how he was going to die young, that he allegedly, and I guess I shouldn't even say allegedly because she has text exchanges that she's shown, unless those are fabricated, where he had told her as much. And then most recently, she says she has discovered, or had brought to her attention, messages within 24 hours of Charlie Kirk's assassination where he told other people that he thought that he was going to be killed on the day that he was killed. And that was just the day before the killing took place. And so that is a seismic claim. But up to this point, in the drip, drip, drip manner that she has been providing the information that she has, ultimately has all turned out to be true. So far as I can tell, there have certainly not been, other than those quibbles about minor details, there have not been any substantial refutations of anything that she's claimed. And so it could be that Charlie Kirk, too, was a variation of lunatic as well. Both Candace Owens and Charlie Kirk are especially charismatic and extroverted and telegenic, and there does tend to be overlap in personality traits between charisma and lunacy. Getting back to the thinker, influencer, power wielder trichotomy that we talked about last week, the thinker types, the ones most welded to empirical realities and logical consistency in their idea conceptions and the way that they rationalize things, tend not to be the most fantastical thinking or charismatic types of people, because people have innate abilities, and as those abilities are revealed and discovered over time, people tend to lean into what their natural predilections and affinities are. And so the people who are naturally gregarious and charismatic and extroverted don't tend to spend as much time bookishly digging into the details of every rabbit hole and ensuring that every assertion that they make has no potential self-contradictory elements in it. But the reason, though I think this is a plausible possibility, whereas the conception of Candace Owens as an outright psychopathic liar strikes me as obviously incorrect, the reason that the lunacy option, while potentially possible, seems highly unlikely is because the extensive case that she is making and continues to make is full of damning, empirically validatable assertions, none of which have been refuted. And that is why I think that the third option, for which I will now drop the alliterative Lord and just say the option is that she is telling the truth, that is the best read I have on the situation. And the events of the last week underscore that assessment of the situation. After 3 months nearly of refusing to engage with any of the putatively, from Turning Point USA's perspective, putatively wild, outrageous, and false claims that Candace Owens was making, and instead spending all of their energy on impugning her character. After 3 months of that, come this week, a seemingly out of the blue offer to ostensibly finally refute everything that Candace Owens has said, but in a manner that seems almost certain to be merely a tool for additional propaganda without actually addressing the steel man assertions that Candace Owens is making, at most dealing with them in a dismissive straw man way. And to the question of how that is the case, if Candace Owens, as Turning Point USA, is being invited to provide input, well, then she's going to be able to make her case, isn't she? But there is the rub, because the invitation to make her case that is being offered was presented in a way where it was announced on X at midnight with a 24-hour ultimatum for Candace Owens to respond. And when Candace Owens said that she would love to participate in just such a conversation, the stipulation was then added by Turning Point USA that she had to appear at Turning Point USA's headquarters at 2 p.m. on Monday, December 15th. Candace Owens had very obviously presumed that this would be a live-streamed conversation, because that is what Turning Point USA does regularly. That's how almost all, outside of Joe Rogan, is really one of the notable exceptions, who strongly prefers in-person interviews, although that is not something that is a hard and fast rule for Joe Rogan. At least it hasn't always been. I recall an episode where he had Peter Schiff on via live stream, and Peter Schiff was in Puerto Rico at the time, and it was an atrocious listening experience because there was delays in the voice communication that caused all kinds of problems, with each person interrupting the other without realizing that one or the other had finished speaking. And so a general preference for face-to-face, in-person communication is understandable. The idea that in this current situation that it would be a mandate as part of the Turning Point USA ultimatum to have already determined a time without trying to coordinate it with Candace Owens, whose show starts at exactly 2 p.m., and then to refuse to do it over live stream. And what is especially humorous in a satirical onion sort of way is that this is being explained by Blake Neff and Andrew Colvett at Turning Point USA, while Andrew Colvett is not at Turning Point USA's headquarters. He is live streaming from an off-site location to talk about how Candace Owens is being mandated to appear in person. The cliched, you can't make this stuff up, is applicable here. because the optics of this are such that you really can't make it up. Nick Fuentes wrote, "You were invited to Turning Point USA's headquarters to press their leadership live and in person about their role in Charlie Kirk's murder, but you can't go because of a scheduling conflict." And this was in response to Candace Owens communicating to Turning Point USA the following, quote, "Kind of weird how you didn't email or call me to ask about times or availability and chose to instead tweet this information out at midnight. Why am I learning about this on X? December 15th does not work in person, and 2 p.m. Pacific time is also the literal time I do my podcast live every day, which you knew, but we will happily cancel the daily podcast and we'll join you guys live virtually instead for a live stream on the 15th if that works on your end. Let's lock it in," unquote. I think this will get to the point, and Owens is going to have to force the issue by refusing to meet in person with Turning Point USA. There is a mundane reason for this, which is that appearing in person without her research team, with her able to communicate in real time in the studio setup where she has all the information that she has marshaled over the last 3 months, categorized and easily accessible, effectively by forcing her to come and sit live. They are trying to create a situation where she has to effectively do it closed book, make her case closed book, and invariably what will happen, because there are a ton of little details that she has accumulated over the intervening 3 months, that it is virtually guaranteed that by having to recall them off the top of her head in real time in hostile territory is going to result in her getting some number of details wrong, or potentially getting the order of events out of sequence, or some combination or variation of that will then be used as the pushed focal point of the interaction to say that she was debunked in person by Turning Point USA because she got X, Y, and Z detail incorrect. But the far more consequential reason even than that she is not going to appear in person is because she could be killed if she does so. And if the reaction to that is, well, that's outlandish and the optics would be terrible, she was going to go have this discussion with Turning Point USA and then she just mysteriously had an accident, her plane crashed because the FAA has lowered its standards and DEI makes it so that it's not safe to fly anymore, or on the drive to the studio, one of the big rigs crossed the lane and smashed into her and it's just a horrible, tragic coincidence, or even that the French Foreign Legion or Mossad takes the opportunity to take her out and then Turning Point USA is able to do the whole dog and pony show again like they did with Charlie Kirk, only this time mourning Candace Owens, who might also be retconned into being a big supporter of what Turning Point USA's new mission is. And yes, I realize from an Owens side of things in this perspective that I am effectively begging the question. And as a little pedantic aside, raising the question and begging the question are two phrases that are not synonyms, although they are often used interchangeably. Raising the question simply means that you're leading up to a question to be asked based on prior information being provided. In the case of begging the question, what it means is that effectively you are leading to an obvious question being asked for which you already have an answer, and that the question only makes sense in the context of the answer that is already being provided by way of the question being posed at all. And so in this case, begging the question, well, the only reason she would be afraid that Turning Point USA was going to assassinate her is because they already assassinated Charlie Kirk, but we haven't conclusively proven that to be the case or not. That's the whole point of the debate. So how can you use a conclusion that Turning Point USA assassinates people as a reason to be hesitant to come to Turning Point USA to discuss an assassination? But just because the question is going to be begged for rhetorical purposes doesn't mean that the answer that comes from that question is incorrect. And so for the sake of argument, let's say that what Candace Owens is asserting is true, that Turning Point USA or the alphabet intelligence agencies or the military or some foreign militaries or some combination thereof assassinated Charlie Kirk, if that was true, if all of the accusations that Candace Owens is making pan out to be correct, if that is the reality on the ground and you are Turning Point USA, would you, in tandem with whatever additional agencies and institutions were involved, would you have her killed on the way to an in-person conversation about what happened? Because, those optics would be so bad. But would they be worse than the assassination being revealed conclusively to be true? And that is not begging a question, that is merely a rhetorical question, because the answer seems obvious. Because if you would kill Charlie Kirk to take over his organization and redirect it, then would you not also kill the one person who is on to what you've done, the one person of prominence, the one person with any level of influence and salience who is staying on the case doggedly when virtually the rest of the independent right-wing media, let alone the corporate media, the neoliberal establishment, or any other institutional power center or influence-shaping operation, when virtually everyone else agrees with the official story that it was a lone shooter and that the case will play out as it is, and anyone who's asking any questions about it is doing so for base, self-aggrandizing reasons. Would you not also take that one person out so that you could finally bury the story? I'm entirely incredulous that people like Tim Pool or Nick Fuentes, that Owens is entirely full of it and there is nothing to see here about what happened to Charlie Kirk, that if they are oriented that way now, that if, in addition to Charlie Kirk dying, Candace Owens also died, that then suddenly they would become suspicious and also simultaneously incredibly brave, because they would have just seen two people taken out, and that would finally shift their perspective in a way when the logistical details will be almost definitionally more ambiguous because they won't be as public. And that is one of the things that has really stuck in my mind, and it was one of the first aspects of the Charlie Kirk potential assassination theory that caused me initially to balk at, which is, why would this be done so publicly? If the idea was to take out Charlie Kirk because he was beginning to potentially turn on the Zog, Zionist, Israeli-led MAGA project, and that by being able to take him out before that turn had become public knowledge by the vast majority of people who weren't on the cutting edge of everything that Charlie Kirk said and weren't deeply involved, because the vast majority of what he said over time supported that Zog narrative. If taking him out and taking control of his organization was the point, then why do it so publicly? Instead, why not just poison him or have him die in a car wreck or any other number of things that wouldn't be so prone to conspiracy theorizing about details not adding up? And really, the only two answers that make much sense are chutzpah, one, and two, that the public nature of the execution was a feature rather than a bug, and that the subtext would be that people who want institutional power but think they'll be able to decide on their own how they act, that those kind of people come to a sticky end. But if even all the contradictions and curiosities, some of which we've discussed previously, and that Candace Owens has discussed in much more detail over the last 3 months, that if those things weren't enough to move the vast majority of the independent right-wing media, let alone, again, the corporate media or the more general culture more broadly, that if those inconsistencies and curiosities and what happened in Charlie Kirk's public killing weren't enough to cause people to ask hard questions and demand verifiable answers, well then Candace Owens' plane crashing, or her getting sick and having a stroke or a heart attack, or the vehicle that she was in on the highway from the airport on the way to Turning Point USA's headquarters, that it gets blasted by a semi-truck coming the other direction, possibly driven by some illegal seek at something, while it would be remarkably convenient for Turning Point USA at this point in time, would at least be more plausibly deniable in terms of definitive proof that Turning Point USA or any of the other institutions involved had a direct hand in that unfortunate logistical accident. Even though the timing, again, would be curious, it would be harder to come up with concrete evidence showing that foul play was involved. And so if in the case of the public execution, that isn't enough to raise questions, well, then her just dying in transit is unlikely to be enough to raise more questions than she was raising about Charlie Kirk. The reason she is going to have to explicitly force the issue by articulating some concern for her own personal safety is because if she doesn't do so, then this will play out exactly as Turning Point USA hopes it plays out, which is to say that she was invited on and refused to defend her accusations under interrogative pressure, and therefore she is a fraudster and she made it all up. She did it for the clout and the clicks. Because of the asymmetry in institutional power and also the asymmetry in information, creating a situation where the onus, and I'm playing into it here too, the onus is presumed to be on Owens for being apprehensive about appearing in person. But from the perspective of an uncommitted observer from the outside, why in the world wouldn't the same level of onus, I would say even more, be on Turning Point USA to simply accommodate live streaming as they do on almost literally a daily basis on the show that is a 5-day-a-week streamed internet program? Conveniently enough, one of Turning Point USA's live stream listeners joined said Turning Point USA live stream show, the same one that Candace Owens would be live streaming in to discuss the questions around Charlie Kirk's death. Said Turning Point USA member live streamed in the following interaction, and Blake Neff's response as to why Candace Owens needed to appear in person is entirely unconvincing, to put it modestly.
And she's saying she can't attend in person. Can she attend on a live stream? Or and you guys do live streams all the time. And is that going to be an option?
Of course, Gina.
I'm just trying to make this come together.
Of course, Gina. So, first of all, our initial statement, it was on the show on Wednesday. I made it at the request of Erica. All of this has been at the direction and approval of Erica because she heads this. And so what we were announcing there is we said she has said things that are not true, and we did not address them for a long time. We stated the reasons why, that we thought a lot of them were just not, we initially just thought no one would believe a lot of what was being said, and we also just, we remembered the same friendship that Charlie had, and we just hoped that this would go away without requiring any sort of direct statement or confrontation from us. So what was approved is we announced we are going to respond to this, and what I said was we are going to announce a date soon. We actually hadn't agreed on it at the time I read the statement. We're going to announce a date where we're going to respond to this, and once we announce it, Candace is free to attend in person. That is what we announced, and so once we agreed on a time, I announced what the time was going to be. Candace, for her part, had said, you name the time, you name the place. That is what we did. As for why it was put out at that time, I would just say I don't think she had any difficulty in finding out what our scheduled time was. It seems everyone found it out quite quickly. And lastly, on the point of why it's in person, I think it's pretty intuitive that given what is being said, the way this has worked is that it's critical to be in person if you want to be authentic and to be detailed. And that is what we think is a fair request to make if she's going to participate. But regardless, it is going to go forward because we have agreed that some response needs to be made. And so that's going to happen when we announced it on December 15th.
So there it is. It's not authentic. It's not sincere if it's not in person, as you conduct the vast majority of the interactions with guests and members, and even members of not just supportive members of the public who donate to Turning Point USA, but also to other members of the Turning Point USA organization. All of these things that you do on a regular basis via live stream simply cannot be done in the case of Candace Owens' questions about Charlie Kirk's assassination. And by your own admission, as we'll get to in a second, this has been something that has been a tidal wave, an avalanche for Turning Point USA, by way of its own members and some of its smaller donors who are asking the same sort of questions that Candace Owens is asking. So this is not some negligible address just to sort of get it out of the way because you feel some sort of grim duty to do so, even though it's not newsworthy and there's nothing to see here. In contrast, as we will hear Blake Neff admit, this is something that Turning Point USA has tried to ignore, tried to ride out the storm for the last 3 months, and it's been impossible to do so because questions and concerns just keep growing and growing and growing, and Turning Point USA hasn't responded to any of them. Keep that in mind, too, in the context of this ultimatum being offered by Turning Point USA that you have to meet us in person on this specific date in less than 2 weeks, and you've got to come here on your own accord, even though you are fearful of assassination and think that we assassinated one of our own members. You have to do that right now, and we can't negotiate anything in terms of time or place or the method of communication, because it's urgent that we respond exactly then at exactly that point in time and exactly that place. What a bizarre sense of urgency and emphasis on it happening exactly then, exactly now. We can't delay any further after just admitting that for the last 3 months, we've refused as an organization to engage with this at all. So for 3 months, we haven't engaged with it at all. And now we have to engage with it at exactly this time, this location, on exactly these terms, because it's just so important that we do so to clear the air. And before we get to Blake Neff making the offer, it is interesting that Blake Neff is someone who worked for Tucker Carlson and was let go while Tucker Carlson was at Fox News for effectively being this base and red-pilled guy who visited 4chan forums while in an official capacity working for Tucker Carlson. And so he was effectively made untouchable, unemployable. He was canceled. And then Turning Point USA picked him up. And what better person to have do your bidding than someone who you saved from the exile and destruction that befell and marooned so many people in the alt-right and early dissident right days of the Trump phenomenon.
For months, we have received hundreds, thousands, I suspect, emails and calls asking us to respond. People have wanted us to invite Candace on the show, but for a long time, our approach was to say nothing. We did that for several reasons. First, we thought that her prevarications were so absurd that nobody would believe them. We shouldn't have to answer questions about secret tunnels or Egyptian Air Force planes. That sort of thing is just, it's beneath contempt to respond to. The second reason we've said so little, though, is because there's a good rule of thumb, which Charlie followed. Do not feed the trolls. Focus on the mission. Reviving America, uplifting young people, making heaven crowded. Don't give air to people who want to tear you down and sow discord. Lastly, we didn't respond because Charlie always viewed Candace as a friend, and we were holding out hope that she would return that friendship and stop what she was doing.
Neff is reading a prepared statement here. He's not extemporaneously going off the cuff, which makes the Turning Point USA reasoning seem even more tortured. After insinuating that Candace Owens is a troll and that Charlie Kirk would never want to feed the trolls, he then immediately says that Charlie Kirk always viewed Candace Owens as a friend. And of course, Charlie Kirk, his very MO on college campuses was to engage with people who very often attempted to troll him, and he did so in a sincere and genuine and authentic way. He worked through the claims and the assertions that they made. Even if they came in bad faith, he still addressed them in good faith. And so using the legacy of Charlie Kirk, whose, again, his MO was, I'll talk to anyone, ask me anything, in particular people who are hostile to me or to my ideas, ask me anything, to then use that legacy to apologize for why you haven't engaged in good faith with someone who has challenging questions because it's beneath you, just isn't convincing. You're saying that it is beneath you to engage with the most listened to podcast on the planet, allegedly, questions you have been relentlessly deluged by over the last 3 months by your own admission, that those things are beneath responding to, but letting some blue-haired college freshman girl ask the president and CEO of your operation about tired feminist talking points in real time, that's something that is worth responding to, and to responding to again and again and again and again, because this is the nature of what characterized most of Charlie Kirk's interactions on college campuses, which was what Turning Point USA is most known for and became most influential for.
But a week from now, it's going to be 3 months since Charlie's murder. Candace has not changed her behavior. She has continued to spread falsehoods about Charlie's friends, and she continues to concoct new ones about new people. She's using these falsehoods to enrich herself while dividing the conservative movement at an absolutely critical time for this country. And far too often, we here have heard from ordinary people, people who loved Charlie and who Charlie loved so much in return. These people have expressed the worry that we are staying silent out of cowardice or as some sort of tacit admission that some of the attacks are true. Neither is the case. Our silence has never been, and it will never be, equal to complacency or approval. Still, we decided Charlie would not allow this to go on. Charlie was not a coward. Charlie was a fighter. Charlie would not allow someone to spread lies about the people closest to him with impunity. And he would feel ashamed if other people were stepping up to defend his friends while he never did so himself. Candace has mentioned several times that the ball is in our court. So here's what is going to happen. In the near future, there will be a live stream here in Phoenix where we address in a clear and comprehensive way the claims and accusations, the false accusations that have been made against Charlie's family, friends, and the people here at Turning Point. We plan to walk through everything carefully and thoroughly. If Candace is available, we would sincerely welcome her participation in that live stream at our studio here in Phoenix. At this point, we believe the ball is back in her court. Our motivation for doing this is not out of any obligation to Candace. It is about honoring Charlie. We feel a deep responsibility to protect his legacy, his work, and the truth. I feel that.
That was via Blake Neff, Turning Point USA's invitation that was not communicated directly to Candace Owens, but was released on X, to which Candace Owens immediately and emphatically replied that she would love the opportunity to participate in that live stream. And Turning Point USA is hiding behind the fact that while they did characterize it as a live stream, they said that Candace Owens was welcome to, again.
If Candace is available, we would sincerely welcome her participation in that live stream at our studio here in Phoenix.
And so a live stream show that regularly live streams in other people to participate in the show will not include Candace Owens unless Candace Owens shows up in person. I suspect Candace Owens was a bit naive or simply overwhelmed by the opportunity, the offer being made, that she jumped at it without honing in on the fact that Neff and Turning Point USA was intentionally setting it up so that she wasn't able to actually make good on what they were offering by demanding that she showed up in person. They were able to spin it so that when she immediately accepted presuming, again, because it was a live stream show that regularly live streams in outside guests, that her participation in studio meant that she would be live streaming in real time on the show. And the Turning Point USA side of things can get lawyerly about saying, well, we did say, quote, welcome her participation in that live stream at our studio in Phoenix. But come on, given the concerns that she obviously has about executions and the assertions that she's making, to not explicitly hone in on that point was done, because they could have, what Neff could have said is, and this is not an offer for live streaming, we want her here so that we can talk to her in person. If he would have emphasized that, she would have caught it immediately. But instead, she just assumed, as most people would assume before the blow up about how it wasn't going to happen if Candace Owens didn't fly or drive to the studio and appear in person on the set of the Charlie Kirk show with all of the Turning Point USA people, that if she didn't do that, then it wasn't going to happen and all bets were off, and this was the only opportunity for her to take the offer, yes or no. And so she excitedly said yes, because there was only a 24-hour period for which this ultimatum was going to exist before the offer was going to be rescinded. And so she immediately said yes. And again, this was released, the details of it were released at midnight with a 24-hour period for her to respond, and she said yes. And so after saying yes, and she would be glad to live stream, it was then responded to her, well, you can't do the live stream, you have to show up in person, and you already said yes, so if you don't show up in person, then you're reneging on your commitments to engage. As aforementioned, I think Candace Owens will explicitly make it known that the reason she is not going to show up in person is because if they killed Charlie Kirk, then they would not blush at killing her also. While this will provide Turning Point USA with an event, a non-event billed as an event to point to and say, hey, this is when we aired all the perceived dirty laundry and addressed it all and debunked it all, and Candace Owens said she was going to show up and then she didn't, which is how they will spin it inevitably. It will not diminish her influence or popularity among the same grassroots that, of course, Turning Point USA is fighting for, that are, despite the efforts of virtually all the independent right-wing media influencers like Steven Crowder and Nick Fuentes and Tim Pool, the majority sentiment of the modal Turning Point USA supporter, I think, is captured well in a response to that initial offer made by Neff on account of Turning Point USA to have Candace Owens participate in their live stream. Parentheses, but only if she can do it in person. Quote, please accept some warm, well-meant advice. I have been on the outside looking in since Charlie was murdered. I have no allegiance, no dog in the fight, and no skin in the game. I have watched everyone on all sides of this and watched it unfold and tried to remain unbiased. The only thing making me believe Candace is everyone's reaction to Candace. When I see people deliberately twist her words or misquote her, it's suspicious. She's given you more than enough actual material to not have to do that. When I see people embark on campaigns to discredit someone or paint them as insane or silly or crazy without actually addressing their claims, it makes me wonder why you would do that. I have no idea who murdered Charlie, but I do know it wasn't an ideologically gay Mormon with a penchant for dressing like a cat with his granddad's antique rifle, who then confessed in the style of Keats via text. That much was obvious. What isn't obvious is why you're all believing that mad narrative and not going full Candace. And that is why so many people believe her over you. So a gentle word to the wise. Open your door to her. Have a calm and truthful conversation. In the internet age, that will be the prevailing sentiment, particularly among those on the right who receive most of their media via independent sources. One notably very salient, popular, influential person on the independent right who has not weighed in strongly one way or the other with regards to Turning Point USA, Charlie Kirk's assassination, and Candace Owens's accusations is Tucker Carlson, who continues to try to be a sort of Erasmian figure who creates an open network with all the various factions on the right broadly defined. And to that end, he noted in a recent recording that he doesn't have any duplicate guests on and instead brings as many people as he can on. And that seems to be his plan going forward, to be an overarching figure in the non-neocon right who has an open line of communication with everyone and exists on at least somewhat amicable terms. And I think that is something that is developing over time. Initially, Tucker Carlson dismissed Nick Fuentes as a Fed and then subsequently had him on. And while he allows his guests to impugn others on the right, he has made a concerted effort, and it seems to be something that's difficult for him, but it's something he has noticeably been striving to do. He has not assented to or challenged those internecine or seemingly internecine attacks on the right. And while I don't want to fall into too much confirmation bias, I suspect this is because he is intending to make a run in 2028. And admittedly, that is quite the hot take as far as these things go. Looking at Polymarket for the Republican presidential nominee for 2028, J.D. Vance is far and away the front runner with a 54% chance of being the nominee. Next is Marco Rubio at 8%. Donald Trump himself at 5%, and to the idea that what you think there's some number of Republicans who want Trump to run or think Trump will run for a third term. Well, the short answer is yes, there probably are a few who would support him if he went in that direction. But these betting markets, just because this is for the Republican presidential nominee, does not mean, of course, that only committed Republicans are able to participate in these markets. There is non-negligible number of Trump derangement syndrome sufferers out there who genuinely think that it is Trump's intention to effectively abolish or ignore the two-term presidential limit that was put in place after FDR looked like he was trying to set up a president for life scheme. And if you really think an octogenarian Donald Trump would be willing to unconstitutionally seek or force a third term, and you could make $20 for every $1 you put betting on that outcome, because this Donald Trump is showing a 5% likelihood, which means every dollar put down returns 20-fold if Trump ends up getting the nomination. And I have relatives of my own who probably think that this is a distinct, real possibility. Well, this is the market for you. And so I suspect that that's where most of the money is coming from. I don't think there are very many MAGA people who actually think that Trump is going to seek a third term. Next is Ron DeSantis at 4%, and Marjorie Taylor Greene also at 4%, and finally Tucker Carlson shows up with a 3% chance of receiving the nomination. The dance that J.D. Vance is tasked with trying to maintain the fancy footwork necessary to navigate it is tough enough, with the imprimatur of being the vice president and therefore the natural successor to Donald Trump's legacy in 2028. And that dance is going to be hard enough to pull off between the grassroots, organic, MAGA populism of no more invading the world and no more inviting the world and no more being in debt to the world, and all of the institutional Con Inc. support for the MAGA agenda, where Israel is the focus of foreign policy and the bottom line for members of chambers of commerce is the most important thing governing domestic policy. Trying to maintain broad support among both of those elements of Republican Party politics that are necessary to secure the nomination. The MAGA base provides the votes, and Con Inc. provides all of the money, and it is becoming increasingly precarious, bordering on impossible to satisfy both of those interests simultaneously. J.D. Vance is going to try to do it. Tucker Carlson will as well, but ultimately I think whoever does is going to be forced to effectively denounce the populist support, and the Con Inc. side is going to mandate that for the money to be there. And so either the nominee denounces MAGA and goes MIGA and subsequently loses the 2028 election by 4 points, or goes the AFD route and tells Con Inc. to pound sand. Either way, I think it's highly unlikely that the presidential administration in 2028 will be Republican. It might feel like an overly bold assertion given how sweeping the Republican victory in 2024 was, but as the Democratic pummeling that happened in early November when the Virginia AG candidate who talked about fantasizing about murdering Republicans' children in their arms and watching it, and where Republicans got beat not just in the high-profile cases, but at the local level and in state legislatures at a brutal rate. We have even more convincing evidence from the special election in Tennessee this week that Republican political prospects have dropped dramatically from just a year ago. In the case of a governor or an attorney general or a mayor of New York City, well, those aren't exactly congressional or executive level at a national scale elections. And so if you stretch, you can convince yourself that that was on account of local concerns. It's a special election and turnout is lower, et cetera, et cetera. But in the case of a House race, these things take place every 2 years everywhere in the country, and a special election, while the timing is unusual, is otherwise about as routine as an election gets. And because it happens every 2 years, or in this case, just 1 year apart, it makes for a very easy, almost apples to apples comparison to where the electorate is now compared to a year ago. And in Tennessee's 7th district, which is a very safe Republican district that was won by the Republican congressman by over 21 points in 2024. In this special election, Republicans eked out a much narrower 9-point win against a really atrocious opponent, and Donald Trump himself got heavily involved trying to rally support for Matt Van Epps, who ultimately won, but again did so against a screechy, repulsive harridan who, speaking of dreams as we did earlier, said the following.
And the recurring dream I've had is standing up in a cafeteria full of women and saying, I don't want children, I want power, and just screaming it at the top of my lungs.
She said famously that she hated everything about Nashville. She has an NPR name. Her name is Afton Bain. And so even with Donald Trump's concerted endorsement and the general repulsivity of, in this House we believe, cat lady leftism of Miss Afton, the Republican margin of victory in the race dropped 12 points from a year ago. Looking at Economist YouGov's poll about generic congressional races over the last 2 weeks, they show Republicans trailing by 7 and then 6 or 7, when on the eve of the 2024 election, where Republicans dominated and Trump won his second term, the GOP was congressionally marginally ahead, although it was pretty much neck and neck. Republicans were up by about a point in the same poll. And so if we've seen a slide of 6 or 7 or 8 points over the last year, if something doesn't turn around, this is going to manifest as a pretty brutal electoral butchery in the midterms. Of course, a year is a long time in politics, and 3 years is a really long time in politics, but this is all against the backdrop of deteriorating economic and demographic conditions on the ground for Republicans. I'll end on a bit of an aside as to why Miss Afton's dream of acquiring power and being cheered on in doing so by a bunch of other women, childless women, because the subtext here, of course, is that children are an obstacle to attaining power, and ultimately it's power that women should seek. Why that is at a visceral level so off-putting to people with healthy psychological makeups who are well-adjusted members of a viable, functioning society. And that is because, at the essence, the very fundamental ingredient required for civilizational sustainability is for female fertility to occur unencumbered. There is no better way to choke off a society, a civilization, to destroy it than to kill off or sterilize its women of reproductive age. Reproductive aged women are the most valuable human asset a society, a civilization has. Imagine, as a thought experiment at a small scale, that a ship is shipwrecked and washing ashore on a deserted tropical island are 50 people from that shipwreck who survive. If 48 of them are men and 2 are women, then the society is finished with that generation. It goes from 50 people in this generation to 5 or 6, 7 or 8 at best in the subsequent generation, because there is a bottleneck at the most valuable resource in that population, namely women of reproductive age. But if conversely, of those 50 people, 48 of them are nubile women and 2 are men, well, then the civilization has about as strong a fighting chance for viability into the future as could be conceived of in a population of just 50 people. And we can, of course, spin up different scenarios where the mix is more detailed, and we're talking about people postmenopausal women or young children. But no matter how we work the numbers, by far the most predictive factor in terms of the viability of that hypothetical shipwrecked society maintaining itself into the future is the number of women of reproductive age who are among the founding 50 population. There do need to be a couple of non-impotent men, but that is really the only requirement on the male side of the equation, even if the men are older. And because at an instinctive, visceral level, people understand exactly that, what she is dreaming about bringing about is a situation where artificially, through her will to power, that the nubile women of childbearing age under her direction voluntarily make themselves celibate and sterile and refuse to reproduce, not as a consequence of some unfortunate genetic condition or hardship, but as an actual aspiration. She is, in a clip, advocating for the destruction of civilization. And fortunately, in a red district, in a red state in Tennessee, that wasn't enough to secure a congressional seat, but it was a lot closer than it should have been. And that is a portent, however unpleasant, that cannot be ignored. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. Talk to you next time.